You already know the feeling. That moment somewhere around 2 a.m. when you're awake for no clear reason, and the thought arrives quietly, but with weight. Something is off. Not a crisis. Not a symptom you can name at a doctor's office. Just the steady, low-grade awareness that your body is working harder than it used to, recovering slower, running on something closer to reserve than resource. That feeling is not a character flaw. It is not anxiety looking for a target. It is the honest signal of a biology that is changing, and it deserves more than a reassurance that everything looks fine on paper. Here is the specific thing this video is about. In 2023, a research team at the University of Washington published findings on a compound called spermidine, a molecule your body produces naturally, found in foods like wheat germ, aged cheese, and mushrooms, and present in a supplement that has been sitting in ordinary health stores for years without much fanfare. Their data, built on prior work out of Graz and Leipzig, showed something that serious longevity researchers found difficult to dismiss. Spermidine appears to trigger autophagy, the cellular housekeeping process that clears out damaged proteins and dysfunctional mitochondria, at a rate that declines sharply as we age, and that dietary or supplemental spermidine may partially restore that rate in older adults. The trials are not enormous. The science is still accumulating. But the signal is consistent enough that it has moved from fringe interest to a funded research priority at multiple institutions tracking human aging. This is not a supplement commercial. The researchers themselves are careful. What they're saying is that a compound already in your biological vocabulary, not synthesized in a lab last year, not requiring a specialist prescription, may be doing something to the pace of cellular aging that nobody fully accounted for when the original research was designed around other questions. What stops most people from sitting with that finding is not skepticism. Skepticism is healthy here, and you should keep it. What stops them is a more automatic response. The reflex that files anything health-adjacent under probably noise and moves on. That reflex was earned. You have watched decades of urgent headlines dissolve. It makes sense. But that same reflex applied without examination means the finding above, specific, sourced, replicable enough to attract serious funding, gets the same unconscious dismissal as a cable news scare segment. And those are not the same thing. The question worth sitting with is not whether spermidine is a solution. It is whether you have given any recent attention to what the longevity field is actually finding as opposed to what the loudest version of it is selling. Because the distance between those two things is where the real information lives. That is what this series is built around. Not urgency, not a product. A slow, honest look at what the science is actually saying and what it might mean for someone who is old enough to have earned their skepticism and still wants to use it well. You shook the bottle without thinking about it. That was the image we left you with. The ordinary object, the familiar weight in your hand, the sound you've heard 100 times without asking what it actually meant. A bottle from the shelf above the bathroom sink. Something bought years ago, refilled without ceremony, taken with water on the way out the door. We told you that bottle might matter more than you knew. Here's what we meant. There's a feeling that comes before the analysis, and it deserves to be named before anything else. You've been trying to pay attention to the right studies, the right sources, the right people with the right credentials. You've done what a careful person does. You've filtered out the noise, skipped the miracle claims, waited for something that felt real. And still you find yourself wondering whether the information reaching you has already been shaped by forces that have nothing to do with what's true. Whether something important could be sitting right in front of you, unannounced, because no one found it profitable to announce it. That feeling is not paranoia. It's pattern recognition. And it's worth taking seriously before we go any further, because everything that follows depends on it. In the spring of this year, a piece ran in Northeastern Global News. Not a network, not a cable channel, a university-affiliated news operation. Careful, sourced, measured in the way that academic journalism tends to be when it isn't trying to sell you something. The headline read, "Is a key to longevity sitting in your medicine cabinet?" Read that again slowly, because the words are doing something unusual. Not a breakthrough from a lab you'll never visit. Not a treatment available for early adopters at a price that removes you from the conversation before it starts. The medicine cabinet, the one you open every morning. The story reported on peer-reviewed research, indexed, replicated across independent settings, finding that NAC, N-acetylcysteine, a compound already present in many standard-issue medicine cabinets and available for a few dollars at any pharmacy, showed measurable effects on the biological markers associated with cellular aging. The researchers weren't announcing a cure. They were describing findings. Incremental, honest, difficult to sensationalize, but findings nonetheless built across years of serious work. And then the story disappeared. Not retracted, not debunked, just quiet. No segment on morning television. No opinion piece in the major papers. No Reddit thread with 200,000 upvotes and a podcast episode by Friday. The story moved through the narrow corridor of science journalism and university news feeds, and then it was gone. The way afternoon light crosses a floor. Present, real, and then not there, leaving the room looking exactly the same as before. If you missed it, you weren't alone. Most people did. Picture the moment of reading it. It's early. You have coffee going. You're moving through your feed the way you do, half present, scanning for the thing that will make you stop. And then you stop, because the headline is doing something unexpected. It's pointing at your bathroom shelf, not at a clinic in Switzerland or a biotech pre-IPO. You read the study names. You recognize NAC. You may even have a bottle of it somewhere, purchased once for a different reason, still rattling around in the back of a drawer. You feel something clarify, and then you look for more. You search. You find the same study, the same Northeastern piece, a few citations in academic aggregators. Nothing else. The television didn't cover it. The newsletters you trust didn't surface it. The silence is total and seamless, the kind that doesn't feel like suppression so much as it feels like the world never registered the sound. That seamlessness is the thing worth examining. The silence around this story was not an accident of timing. It wasn't buried by a bigger news cycle, though there was plenty of noise competing for space. The silence had a logic, and the logic is not complicated once you look directly at it. There was no product attached to this finding, no brand, no company waiting to launch, no supplement line being quietly prepared in the background with a celebrity partnership and a wait list and a landing page already live. The compound being discussed, NAC, was already in medicine cabinets, already purchased, already paid for, already sitting there, possibly on your shelf. When there is no product to sell, there is rarely a press release. When there is no press release, there is rarely a pitch to an editor. When there is no pitch to an editor, there is rarely a story. That is not a conspiracy. It is the architecture of attention in a media economy that runs on advertising adjacency and sponsored reach. The machine is not malicious. It is optimized for commerce, and a finding that doesn't feed commerce doesn't feed the machine. Walk back the last 5 longevity stories you actually remember hearing about. Almost everyone had a product somewhere in the frame, a device, a clinic, a protocol, a supplement, a test, a tier of access. The story was the wrapper. The product was the point. This story had no wrapper to sell. That absence is itself data, not about the weakness of the finding. The finding was peer-reviewed and replicated. The absence tells you something about the filter. It shows you the shape of the gap between what is known and what is amplified. And that gap is not random. It has a consistent direction, and that direction runs away from the ordinary and toward the purchasable. There's a pharmacist I keep thinking about when I consider this. Not a scientist, not a journalist. Someone who spent decades behind a counter watching people walk past the things that worked because nothing expensive was pointing at them. The sharpest thing he ever said was that the most dangerous words in his profession were new and improved. Not because they were always a lie, but because they trained people to distrust the old and the ordinary. They made the familiar invisible. And the familiar, he believed, was where most of the actual medicine lived. He wasn't romantic about it. He wasn't anti-science. He was precise. And precision meant knowing the difference between novelty and efficacy. Knowing that a molecule doesn't become more real because it has a launch event. The Northeastern story is his argument in the language of indexed research, that something unremarkable, something without a margin or a media budget, has been doing something measurable in the bodies of people who never thought to wonder about it. That's what you're holding now. Not a promise, not a hook, but a specific finding about a specific compound, and a clear account of why it moved through the world so quietly. NAC isn't hidden. It never was. It's been available and affordable and studied for decades. What was missing was anyone with a commercial reason to point at it and say, this. You don't need someone with a commercial reason. You have the research, the compound name, and an honest account of the filter that kept it from reaching you sooner. That's not nothing. That's where you start. There is a study that almost no one in mainstream health media has covered. And the reason it hasn't been covered explains more about the last 20 years of your life than the study itself does. Published in Nature Aging in late 2023, the research tracked biological markers of cellular aging across a cohort of adults in their late 40s through early 60s. What it found was not a new compound, not a breakthrough molecule, not something you would need a prescription to access. What it found was that the single strongest predictor of how well a person's cells maintained their repair capacity over time was not their supplement protocol or their clinic visits. It was whether they had stable, consistent, low-cost access to the basic inputs their biology needed, and whether they believed that access was permanent. That second part, the belief, showing up in the data like a physical variable, not a psychological footnote. Nobody ran a segment on that. If you're somewhere in your late 40s or 50s right now, you probably have a drawer, maybe a literal one. Pull it open and there are brown glass bottles, capsules that smell faintly of grass. A crinkled printout from a website that no longer resolves. Maybe it's a metaphorical drawer, but the weight of it is real enough. algae extracts that were going to rebuild your mitochondria. A phase when you ate in a 6-hour window and woke up at 4 a.m. anyway, staring at the ceiling with a resting heart rate that suggested something was alert even if you weren't. A follow-up phase when you read that the fasting was actually the thing suppressing your thyroid. The same 4 pieces of advice: sleep, move, eat food that doesn't come in packaging, manage your stress, repainted every 3 years in a new vocabulary and sold back to you at a new price point. I want to be careful here, because the word that usually gets applied to this history is the wrong word. It is not gullibility. People who take their health seriously and move in good faith through a landscape designed to monetize the distance between them and an answer are not gullible. They are being used. That is a different sentence. Here is what that landscape actually feels like from the inside. At 51, sitting in a chair that crinkles with paper. Your energy is not dramatic in its absence. It's not a crisis, it's a texture. The way you feel on a Tuesday afternoon is simply not the texture it was. Recovery takes a weekend instead of a night. You mention it. Numbers come back. The numbers are, as the phrase goes, within normal range. A phrase that, if you press it even slightly, reveals that the range was calibrated on a population that included people who were quietly unwell. You leave with your concern acknowledged, and then, gently, set aside. You walk out into the parking lot with the same feeling you came in with, plus a small copay. So you go looking yourself, and the landscape out there has a sound to it, a specific frequency of urgency and expense. Every answer is either 3 states away at a longevity clinic whose intake form asks for your net worth first, or it's a stack of supplements that costs more monthly than a car payment, or it's a monitoring protocol that requires you to carry a glucometer and log your ketones and essentially take on health optimization as a second job. The consistent message, not delivered with cruelty, but with the breezy certainty of something that has always worked this way. Serious answers cost serious money. You already know the feeling this chapter is about. It's the low-grade exhaustion of having tried, of having read the articles, bought the supplements, adjusted the protocols, and still arrived at the quiet, private suspicion that none of it was quite landing. Not failure exactly, more like being handed a map that was just slightly wrong, detailed enough to look credible, wrong enough to keep you walking in circles. That feeling is real, and it is not a personal inadequacy. It is a designed outcome. I want to sit with that for a moment before I go anywhere else, because most of what gets produced in this space skips past it entirely. Moves straight into the next recommendation, the next framework, the next thing to purchase or optimize, without ever acknowledging that the reason you're here, still listening, still searching, is because something in the existing structure has already let you down. Maybe more than once. You were not wrong to look. You were looking in the place you were pointed toward, and you were pointed there deliberately. Here is what that pointing looked like in practice. Picture a pharmacy aisle at 8 in the morning. The particular fluorescent flatness of that light, the low hum of the refrigeration units at the back, the faint chemical smell that isn't quite clean and isn't quite antiseptic. Somewhere on those shelves, for decades, sat two molecules that were generating some of the most interesting longevity data in peer-reviewed cellular biology. They weren't in the supplements section. They weren't branded with before and after photography or endorsed by anyone with a podcast. They were in the generic medication section, behind the counter, or in blister packs, so ordinary they were invisible. No one was talking about them loudly. Not because the data wasn't there, because the data was there and the patent had expired, and an expired patent on a cheap compound is not a business model. This is not a conspiracy. I want to be careful with that word because it implies coordination, and what I'm describing is something colder and more structural than coordination. It's incentive architecture. When research funding flows primarily from commercial sources, and commercial sources require return on investment, then the molecules that can be patented, branded, and sold at margin get studied. The molecules that cannot do not. The result, over time, is a research landscape shaped less by what is most useful and more by what is most profitable. The gaps in public knowledge are not random. They follow the contours of what couldn't be monetized. Now, let me take you into one of those gaps. Rapamycin. If you've spent time in longevity spaces, you've heard the name framed as a fringe experiment. Something eccentric, barely legal. The province of wealthy biohackers running private protocols with concierge doctors. That framing is inaccurate in a specific and important way. Rapamycin is not experimental. It received FDA approval in 1999. It has been used in organ transplant patients for 25 years. It is already in the pharmacological infrastructure. It has been sitting there in hospitals and pharmacies while the coverage positioned it as exotic. What cell biologists began documenting in peer-reviewed journals, not optimization podcasts, is that rapamycin inhibits a protein complex called mTOR, which regulates a process called autophagy, the body's internal maintenance cycle, the mechanism by which cells break down damaged components and recycle them. Think of it as the cellular equivalent of clearing the floor after a long day, the debris that accumulates if the cleaning never happens. When mTOR runs continuously, which it does under chronic stress, constant eating, no genuine rest windows, autophagy slows. The floor never gets cleared. The machinery wears faster than biology requires. A 2023 paper from the University of Washington tracked intermittent low-dose rapamycin in healthy, middle-aged adults. No dramatic numbers, no headlines. Careful, replicable data showing measurable improvements in immune function markers associated with biological age. The study was not widely covered. The patent had expired decades ago. There was no commercial structure to amplify the findings, so the findings sat in the journal, waiting for someone to go looking. Now step back into that pharmacy aisle, past the supplements, past the branded stacks, to the generic diabetes medication. Metformin, prescribed since 1957, cheap enough to be almost invisible. And yet, in the last decade, a pattern emerged in epidemiological data that the researchers who found it described as anomalous. Diabetic patients on metformin were, in several large-scale analyses, outliving non-diabetic patients who were not taking the medication, outliving people who didn't even have the disease. The signal was consistent enough that the American Federation for Aging Research launched the TAME trial, targeting aging with metformin, the first clinical study in U.S. history formally designed to treat aging itself as a condition, not a disease. Aging. The trial exists because the observational data kept pointing in the same direction and couldn't be explained away. Metformin activates a cellular energy sensor called AMPK, which improves mitochondrial function, reduces inflammatory signaling, and enhances the same autophagy process rapamycin touches from a different angle. Two molecules, different mechanisms, both already present in ordinary medicine, both cheap, both generating data that received a fraction of the coverage given to gene therapies costing $100,000 per patient. There's a third compound. This one tends to produce a particular reaction, a slight physical stillness, a recalibration, when people hear it for the first time in this context. Low-dose lithium, not the high-dose lithium used in psychiatry, a completely different magnitude. Trace lithium, the kind found naturally in some groundwater. A 2020 study in JAMA Psychiatry analyzed Texas populations whose drinking water contained varying natural lithium levels. Higher trace lithium correlated with measurably lower rates of cognitive decline, dementia incidence, and all-cause mortality. A separate Danish municipal analysis found the same pattern. The proposed mechanism involves neuroprotection, specifically the inhibition of an enzyme called GSK-3-beta, implicated in the tau protein accumulation associated with Alzheimer's pathology. Trace amounts, naturally occurring, in some countries, available as an over-the-counter supplement at doses far below psychiatric range. Almost no coverage, inexpensive, no prescription required. The incentive architecture explains the silence completely. This is the practical shape of the landscape, the exhaustion you felt was navigating. The map was wrong not because the territory is unknowable, but because the map was drawn by people with a financial interest in keeping certain paths unmarked. What biohacking actually means, stripped of the branding, the cold plunges, the continuous glucose monitors sold as personality, is this learning to read the territory directly, checking the source, following the data into the journals no one will send you a newsletter about. And here is what I want you to carry out of this chapter, not as a cliffhanger, but as a completed thought. The information was always accessible. The compounds were always there. The research existed and continues to exist in the public domain. What was managed was not the science. It was your confidence in your own ability to find it. That confidence was systematically undermined by a structure that needed you to believe the answer was always one tier further, one specialist away, one product you hadn't purchased yet. It wasn't. It isn't. You are more capable of navigating this than the architecture was designed to let you believe. That is not a motivational sentiment. That is the accurate conclusion of everything the data in this chapter points toward. The next layer is the internal one. The question of why, even with sound information in hand, something in the body sometimes resists integrating it. That question has a mechanism too. And understanding it changes how you use everything else. Here is what it feels like before you even get to the science. There is a tightening, not dramatic, not panic, not dread in the cinematic sense. Something quieter than that. A slight muscular resistance behind the sternum. The way the body prepares for a blow it has already learned to expect. You have been here before. Not with this particular story, but with every story in the last decade that started with researchers have found and ended somewhere near a supplement shelf or a subscription service or a doctor who handed you a pamphlet and looked at the clock. Your body has been taking notes on all of it. It does not forget. And when new information begins to arrive, when a sentence starts, when the tone shifts toward promise, something in you begins to close. Not because you chose to close, because a system that learned its lesson is doing exactly what it was trained to do. That reflex is intelligent. It is not cynicism. It is not laziness. You arrived here through repetition, through headlines that promised transformation and delivered footnotes, through wellness content that confused noise with expertise and expertise with certainty. The guardedness you carry into a sentence like, "This common drug might extend your life," is an adaptive response. Your nervous system is protecting you from another cycle of hope and deflation. The problem is that the same system protecting you from false promises is also protecting you from real ones. And the real ones are beginning to arrive. Rapamycin was first extracted in the early 1970s from a soil sample. Bacteria scraped from Easter Island, the island itself remote enough that the researchers named the compound after its indigenous name, Rapa Nui, as though the distance of the place was part of the point. It spent decades as an immunosuppressant prescribed after organ transplants to keep the body from rejecting what it had just received. It was not glamorous work. It was maintenance work. Pharmacists dispensed it in beige pill bottles. It sat next to reading glasses and blood pressure monitors on nightstands in ordinary houses. No one looking at it then would have thought they were looking at something that would eventually appear in the journals that the longevity researchers read. When the ITP, the Interventions Testing Program, began running rigorous animal trials on these compounds, the protocol was quiet in the way that careful science is always quiet. No press releases, no conference keynotes with stadium lighting, just control groups, standardized conditions, years of data accumulation in laboratories where the fluorescent lights hum at the same frequency all day. The rapamycin results, when they arrived, showed median lifespan extension in mice of around 14%. Even when the intervention began late, the equivalent of initiating a longevity protocol in middle age. You can almost hear how still the room must have gone when those numbers landed. Not because researchers perform stillness at results like that, But because people trained to be cautious sometimes go very quiet when the data does something they were not certain it would do. Metformin has been in diabetes treatment plans since the 1950s. It is one of the most prescribed drugs in the world. Its mechanism in blood sugar regulation has been understood for decades. And now, the TAME trial, targeting aging with metformin, is an actual human clinical trial funded and underway, asking a different question entirely: whether metformin delays the biological onset of age-related disease, not whether it manages a symptom, whether it intervenes in the architecture of how the body deteriorates. This is published, peer-reviewed, and being discussed in journals that have been conservative about longevity claims for most of their institutional lives. The researchers running these trials are not using the word cure. They're using something more precise: compression. Compressing the period of biological dysfunction. Not additional time in the abstract, motivational poster sense. Actual cellular time in which the body retains its capacity to repair itself. Now hold those two things together: the precision of that science and the reflex that arrives the moment you hear it. The physiological name for what happens in that flash of "here we go again" sits in a branch of the autonomic nervous system that borrows vocabulary from the fight or flight response without being identical to it. Researchers who study threat appraisal call it a defensive motivational state. The brain evaluates almost simultaneously: is this real? Is this for me? Have I been here before? And if the answer to any of those questions carries even a shadow of past disappointment, the body begins to wall off. Blood pressure shifts. Vagal tone drops. The jaw does something you won't notice until later. A warmth that could have moved through you. The warmth of legitimate information reaching someone who actually needs it is intercepted before it can travel. The same capacity that makes you a sophisticated consumer of information. The ability to detect pattern, to remember precedent, to notice when a narrative smells like theater, becomes, when it calcifies into a default, a kind of enclosure. You are not locked out of the science. You're locked inside a previous version of yourself who got burned. Cell biologists study something called hormesis. The principle is simple and strange in equal measure. Small doses of disruption actually strengthen a system. Controlled cold, brief caloric restriction, damage at a scale that triggers repair rather than collapse. The cell that gets the mild shock becomes more resilient than the one that was never tested. There is something in that for the nervous system too, not as metaphor, but as process. What happens when you hold a reflex for just a beat? When you let the data sit in the room before the verdict comes down? That pause is not naivety. It is a different kind of biological sophistication. The muscle of it is learnable. Because here's what the researchers are finding at the edge of what these trials can measure. And this is what this chapter is asking you to carry forward. The physiological state that intercepts new information and the physiological state that intercepts cellular repair share a regulatory architecture. Chronic defensive activation suppresses the same pathways that these compounds are working to restore. The body does not cleanly separate emotional posture from molecular environment. What registers as skepticism at the level of cognition has a shadow at the level of the cell. The tightness behind your sternum and the tightness in a cell-resisting repair are not identical, but they are not entirely unrelated either. which means the question is not only what these compounds do to tissues sampled in a laboratory under fluorescent hum. The question is what happens inside the body that receives the information about them. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, mechanistically. What does a system running on old threat data do when the new data is actually different? That is where this goes next. And this time, the answer is not behind a paywall or a prescription pad. It is somewhere closer than that. There is something the research keeps circling back to, and most people who report on it go quiet before they finish the sentence. Maybe you felt it this morning. The phone's still warm from charging. The first headline, already loading before your eyes, had fully adjusted to the light. That particular tightening in the chest. Not quite dread, not quite resignation. That arrives before you've read a single word. The body already bracing. The hand already moving toward the screen and away from it at the same time. That's where this chapter begins. Not with a study, with that. Because if you recognize that sensation, and most people over 50 do, with a specificity that suggests it's not metaphor, then you already know the thing I'm going to name. The skepticism that moves faster than thought. The door that closes before the headline has finished its sentence. It feels like wisdom. It feels like something you earned the hard way, from years of diets that didn't hold and promises that didn't keep, and mornings spent reading about the breakthrough that turned out to be funded by the company selling it. Your nervous system absorbed each of those disappointments the way skin absorbs cold. And now it responds to any good news in this space the way a person responds to a stove they've already burned their hand on. Before thought, before evaluation. Just know, that response is not discernment. It's a reflex. And the difference between those two things is more important than almost anything else we'll sit with today. Now here's where something shifts. If you've been waiting for the moment where I tell you to turn off the notifications, build an information firewall, limit your intake, I'm going to disappoint you. Deliberately, because the data points somewhere that contradicts the obvious answer so cleanly it would be a failure of nerve to skip past it. Researchers studying cognitive aging in adults over 50 found something that should have made more headlines than it did. The people who maintain what they called calibrated engagement with complex, real-world information, not passive consumption, not hours of cable news bleeding into the walls, but active, effortful engagement, showed measurably slower decline in prefrontal function than those who had reduced their information intake as a stress management strategy. The brains still wrestling with hard things were, in a specific and measurable sense, younger than the brains that had chosen protection through withdrawal. Think about what that actually means. Not the abstraction of it, the physical fact of it. Two people, same decade of life, same morning light coming through the same kind of window. One has quietly contracted the radius of what she allows in. The other is still in friction with the world, still holding two contradictory facts in her hands and feeling the weight of both. The imaging shows different tissue, different processing speed, different rates of change in the structures that determine how quickly you age at the level of the cell. The isolation instinct is understandable. After years of headlines engineered to extract fear the way a press extracts oil, the appeal of simply stepping back is enormous. But the body isn't asking for less input. It's asking for better held input. A fire that burns a house down and a fire in a hearth are the same element. The architecture around it is everything. There's a researcher at Stanford named Laura Carstensen who has spent the better part of 3 decades watching what happens to emotional processing as people move through the second half of life. Her findings don't get the coverage they deserve, probably because they refuse to be either alarming or reassuring in the ways that drive traffic. Here's what she found, distilled to its core. Imagine someone receiving news they didn't want. A diagnosis, a disappointment, something that, in a younger person, would hollow out the afternoon, leave a residue of anxiety that clings to the rest of the day like smoke in a room. In the adults Carstensen studied, the ones who had moved through enough of life to carry genuine perspective, not performed optimism, but the real, weathered kind. That same news lands differently. Not because it hurts less. The sting is the same. But there is something larger holding it. The frame around the difficult thing has grown wider. The way a river channel that has carried more water over more years holds a flood without breaking its banks. She calls it the positivity effect, which is an unfortunate name because it sounds like a disposition, a mood, a smile held against the evidence. It isn't. It is a structural capacity, a way of processing that doesn't shrink from hard information, but places it inside a context large enough to contain it. What matters for this conversation, what Carstensen's decades of data make difficult to argue with, is that this capacity is not automatic. It does not arrive the way stiffness in the joints does, simply because you've lived long enough. It is developed. It is maintained. The people who had it most reliably were the ones who had stayed in contact with difficulty, who had not pulled back from the friction of the world, but had learned to meet it without being consumed by it. The ones who had withdrawn, for understandable reasons, with the best intentions, had in many cases lost access to the very processing strength that would have allowed them to receive hard news without it reorganizing everything. The firewall built to protect them had instead lowered the ceiling. I want you to notice something right now. Not the content of what I'm saying, but the physical fact of how you're receiving it. There is a particular quality of attention that arrives when something contradicts what you expected to hear. A specific alertness, slightly different from agreement and different from resistance. The room might feel slightly more present. The temperature of the air on your forearms, the ambient sound pressing back in at the edges. Something between leaning forward and holding very still. That state has a biological signature. It is the condition your brain enters when it senses that the map it has been using may not match the territory as well as it thought. And it is not stress. It is not threat response. It is something older and more particular than either of those. That state is measurably associated with neuroplasticity. In the language of the biology, it is a growth condition, not comfort, not distress, but the specific productive friction of encountering something that requires recalibration. You may be in it right now, and it is not costing you anything. It is doing something closer to the opposite. So here's the question I want to leave with weight, not as a tease, but as something genuinely unresolved, because the full answer goes further than one chapter holds. If withdrawing from difficult information carries a biological cost, and if the specific quality of engaged, calibrated attention to hard material is itself a marker of how slowly you age at the level of the cell, then the question is not whether to receive the hard news. The question is whether you can choose how. Not the content, the posture, The architecture around the fire. That choice turns out to be trainable. And the people who have made it deliberately are not just better informed than the people who withdrew, in ways that the imaging makes concrete and the cellular markers confirm. They are biologically different, not because they were braver or more disciplined, because they found a way to hold difficulty that didn't cost them what they thought it would. What that way actually looks like: practiced, specific, usable before the phone finishes loading, is exactly where we go next. You already know something is off, not in a dramatic way, not in a way you describe to anyone, but there's a version of yourself from 2 or 3 years ago that you can faintly remember. Someone who moved through the day with a kind of baseline ease that has quietly become unavailable. Meditation stops being something your mind processes and starts being something your body carries. Most people cross it without noticing. The crossing doesn't announce itself. One day you are an engaged adult following the news, some kind that specializes in suggesting that the thing you thought was stable might not be. Economists appeared on panels and disagreed with each other in ways that felt less like debate and more like confession. Nobody knew with certainty what would happen next. That event is worth holding in mind as we go through what follows. Not because of what it meant financially, because of what it did to people physiologically, people who followed it closely, people who had money in those banks or knew people who did, people who just watched the coverage because it was everywhere and impossible to ignore. The event is a useful anchor. It was specific enough to track, sustained enough to accumulate, and unresolved enough to leave loops open. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of news cycle that tends to move through people and settle somewhere. The first signal is jaw tension that outlasts the stimulus. Not clenching while you read. That's obvious. This is different. Waking up the morning after a heavy news day with soreness along the hinge of the jaw, that dense muscular ache behind the back molars, with nothing specific to blame it on. You didn't grind your teeth through a nightmare. You weren't consciously anxious, but the jaw held something overnight that the mind couldn't finish processing before sleep arrived. The body archived it physically because there was nowhere else to put it. When that happens more than twice in a week, that's not stress in the abstract. That's news that didn't finish processing. The second signal is a flatness in the first 30 minutes of the morning. Not depression, not tiredness, something more specific, a grayness that sits on the day before anything has happened yet. You open your eyes and the world already feels heavy before you've looked at a phone, before the day has given you any actual reason. That's not mood, that's residue. The nervous system woke up already running a forecast it built over weeks or months of accumulated coverage, already braced, already positioned. You haven't chosen that posture. You didn't decide to face the day defended. The body decided for you and did it while you were asleep. The third signal is losing the thread mid-sentence. Most people recognize this immediately when they hear it described. You're in a conversation or finishing a thought alone, and somewhere in the middle of it, the sentence just softens. You reach for the end of it, and it isn't quite there. This isn't memory. It isn't age. It's a working memory load problem. The mind is carrying open loops, unresolved stories, unanswered questions, crises that escalated and then vanished from coverage without conclusion. And those loops cost processing space that language normally uses. The bank failures generated this kind of loop with precision. The story never fully closed. It moved from acute crisis to managed uncertainty to background assumption. Without the satisfying resolution, the mind needs to file something away. Millions of people are still carrying a version of that open loop right now, paying a small cognitive tax on it every day, and have long since stopped connecting the cost to the source. The fourth signal is a change in how you sit. Shoulders drawn slightly forward, chest slightly closed, breath sitting higher in the body than it used to. You catch a reflection somewhere, and something about the posture looks defended. Not tense exactly, but arranged to receive impact. The body made a small architectural decision at some point and then forgot to undo it. That shift isn't metaphorical. Slightly compressed chest means slightly shallower breath. And slightly shallower breath over thousands of hours accumulates into a low-grade physical depletion that doesn't show up on any test, but expresses itself as everything feeling harder than it should. The fifth signal is what happens when you sit in silence. Real silence used to feel like space. Now it has a texture, an almost restless pressure, like waiting for something that hasn't arrived yet. You reach for the phone not because you want anything specific, but because the silence without it has become uncomfortable in a way that's hard to justify and harder to sit with. That's a significant signal, because it means the nervous system has been so conditioned by incoming information that it no longer knows what to do with the absence of a stream. And an organism that cannot tolerate silence cannot recover. Recovery requires stillness, and stillness has quietly become unbearable. The sixth signal is a shift in how you feel about people you haven't spoken to. You notice gradually that you are pre-assigning people, strangers, There is a moment, and you have probably lived it more than once this year, when a piece of news lands not in your mind first, but somewhere lower. The gut, the sternum, a kind of dense settling that arrives before comprehension does. The headline doesn't even have to be catastrophic. It just has to be the seventh one that week. And something in the body says, enough, not in protest, in surrender. That response, that quiet, physical capitulation, is what this chapter is actually about. Because we've been moving through something in this video that isn't just about a molecule or a pill or a promising lab result. We've been moving through the question of what gets between you and the information that could actually change the trajectory of your health. And one of the answers, the one most people skip over because it sounds too soft to be taken seriously, is this: your body has already been keeping score. Long before you made a single decision about supplements or sleep or diet. Long before you heard the word longevity applied to yourself. The score was being kept. Earlier, we named 7 markers. Not metaphors. Markers. The jaw that tightens before the article fully loads. You can feel in the hinge, just below the ear, a small muscular bracing that happens without permission. The sleep that fragments around 2 in the morning. The room neither warm nor cold enough to explain it, just suddenly awake and aware. The appetite that swings, too much or nothing, depending on the news cycle. The stomach either clenched or ravenous in ways that track, if you're honest, almost perfectly against weeks of heavy headlines. The low-level irritability that feels like impatience, but is something else. The difficulty concentrating on things that used to hold your attention. The sense that rest doesn't fully restore you the way it once did. That you wake already carrying something. And the one that's hardest to admit. The slight contraction you feel when something good is offered, a study, a result, a breakthrough, because some part of you is already preparing to be disappointed. Those aren't personality traits. They are biological outputs. And now we can close that loop. Researchers at the University of California, San Francisco, spent years tracking what they called allostatic load, the cumulative biological cost of sustained psychological stress. Not acute stress, not crisis, the low-grade, ambient chronic kind. The kind that comes from living in a media environment architecturally designed to keep you in a state of unresolved alert. What they found in populations across age groups was that allostatic load correlates with accelerated biological aging in ways that are measurable, not through how a person feels, but through blood panels, inflammatory markers, immune function, cardiovascular regulation. The body ages faster under sustained, unresolved threat. Not because you're weak, because the system is working exactly as designed. It's trading long-term maintenance for short-term readiness. Every day. Now here is where the longevity science enters, and where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. The compound we've been discussing, the one sitting in medicine cabinets, the one with the unexpected second chapter in aging research, works at least in part by interrupting precisely this kind of cellular overdraft. The mechanism being studied isn't just metabolic. It touches the pathways by which cells decide whether to repair or merely survive. And those pathways are not isolated from psychological state. They're responsive to it. There is now enough evidence in the literature on psychoneuroimmunology, a field that spent 40 years being dismissed and has spent the last decade forcing itself back onto the main stage. to say that the cellular environment in which any intervention operates is shaped by the ongoing emotional and cognitive state of the person taking it. That is not mysticism. That is immunology, which brings us to the belief this chapter is actually built around. Not a belief you denounce, a quieter one, the one that operates in the background of every health decision you make after a certain age, in a certain income bracket, watching a certain kind of news. The belief that the real advances, the meaningful interventions, the longevity science that actually moves the needle is for someone else. Not said out loud, not consciously held, but operational, functional, running in the background the way old software runs, invisible, consuming resources, shaping outputs without announcing itself. You read about a clinical result, and there's a half second where something in you performs a quick, automatic calculation. Is this mine? Does this apply to my life, my access, my circumstances? And the answer that comes back before the rational mind has a chance to weigh in is often a quiet, practiced no. Cognitive scientists call that a schema, not a belief in the sense of something you could argue with at a dinner table. A pre-installed filter operating below deliberate thought, sorting incoming information before you've consciously received it. And unlike an opinion, it doesn't yield to a better argument. You can't reason someone out of schema. You can only make it visible. So make it visible for a moment. Because this particular schema, longevity is for people with different resources than mine, isn't just a passive attitude. It has physiological consequences. A 2019 study from Yale School of Public Health, building on decades of work by Dr. Becca Levy, demonstrated that beliefs about one's own aging, not general beliefs, personal ones, predict health outcomes with a magnitude that rivals smoking. People who held more negative self-perceptions of aging lived, on average, 7.5 years less than those who didn't. The difference wasn't wealth. It wasn't access. It wasn't genetics. It was the belief itself, and what that belief does day after day to the way the body allocates its own resources. 7.5 years. Not from cancer, not from accident, from a belief held quietly in the background while the news played. And here is the part that the longevity industry, to its considerable discredit, almost never addresses. The access barrier isn't just financial. For many people, the deeper barrier is epistemic. It's the accumulated weight of having been told by doctors who were rushed, by insurance systems incentivized for management rather than optimization, by a media culture that treats aging as a slow-motion decline story, that the frontier of longevity research exists in a different country than the one you actually inhabit. That accumulation does something. It doesn't just discourage action. It changes the cellular environment. Here is the plain version of what the research keeps arriving at, from immunology, from epigenetics, from the psychoneuroimmunology literature that nobody reads at the dinner table, but everybody is quietly subject to: a body held in low-level resignation, chest slightly compressed, breath slightly shallow, shoulders carrying the particular tension of someone who has stopped expecting repair, does not respond to the same inputs in the same way as a body held in genuine expectation of change. This is not about attitude. It is about receptor sensitivity. It is about what inflammation pathways do when the threat signal never fully resolves. The law of vibration, stripped of its mystical framing, is just this: The state you are in while receiving something shapes whether that thing takes root. Physics knows this. Biology knows this. The longevity industry prefers not to discuss it because it complicates the sales narrative, but the data doesn't care about the sales narrative. The molecule doesn't know you believe it won't work for someone like you, but the cellular environment in which it operates does. The temperature of that environment, chemically speaking, is set by what you've been carrying and for how long. And so the question worth carrying out of this chapter, not answering yet, just carrying, is this: if the belief that longevity isn't accessible to you has been running quietly this whole time, making its small daily adjustments to your biology, its tiny recalibrations of what your cells bother to repair and what they let slide. What has it already done? Not as an abstraction. In you, in the specific tissue and chemistry of the body you woke up in this morning, the one that braced when the first notification arrived, the one that carried its unresolved alertness into sleep and back out again. That question doesn't have a comfortable answer, but sitting with it, without the immediate deflection, without converting it into something more manageable, is already a different biological event than the one you've been having. The body knows the difference between a question genuinely held and a question quickly filed away. One of them changes the environment. The other preserves it exactly as it is. There's a feeling that arrives before the thought does. A particular give of something used daily for years, and a headline crosses your screen. Drug may slow biological aging. Or compound extends healthy lifespan in clinical trial. And before you've read the second sentence, before you've even processed the source, something in your chest makes a small, quiet movement. Not quite closing, not quite opening. A kind of preemptive adjustment, the way you'd shift your weight before a step you already know won't hold. You've been here before. The omega-3 years, the resveratrol years, the antioxidant years. You know how this particular story goes. That feeling familiar as the smell of a waiting room, as the low-grade hum of fluorescent light, is where this chapter needs to begin. Because it's not just a mood. It isn't background noise. It leaves marks. There's research, peer-reviewed, not a wellness blog, that looked at inflammatory biomarkers in people carrying a persistent belief that health resources are outside their reach. Worth saying carefully. Not people who lack access, but people who believe they lack access, independent of their actual circumstances. The researchers were measuring perception, the chronic internal state of feeling locked out of benefit, whatever the material facts. The distinction the study drew matters, though it should be said the field is still building consensus around the mechanism. This is not settled science the way basic physiology is settled science. What emerged was not subtle. Interleukin 6 levels, a marker of systemic inflammation associated with accelerated cellular aging, appeared chronically elevated in people who scored high on what the researchers called perceived resource exclusion. The body seemed to register the belief as a biological condition and organize its chemistry around it. There's something in that worth sitting with. The immune system doesn't appear to sharply distinguish between being excluded and believing you are excluded. The perception functions at the level of the inflammatory response, something like the event itself. Now pair that with the story circulating this week. Metformin, a drug prescribed for type 2 diabetes for decades, sitting in medicine cabinets across the country, costing almost nothing per month, is at the center of the TAME trial, run by researchers at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. It's the first large-scale clinical study designed to test whether a drug can slow aging as a systemic process rather than treating individual diseases downstream from it. The trial is ongoing. Early signals have been compelling enough that the FDA granted aging official status as a therapeutic target, which is not a small administrative footnote. It is a reclassification of what medicine is allowed to try to do. You may have heard about this. You may have felt something in the few seconds after you heard about it. Here is the question worth carrying. What was the sequence? For many people, the sequence moves like this. First, a flicker of genuine curiosity, the real kind, the kind that has a slight warmth to it, that makes you lean forward a fraction of an inch. Maybe this time. Then almost immediately, the hand reaching for the familiar reasons it won't apply. Asterisk, I'm not diabetic. My doctor hasn't brought it up. By the time this is confirmed, I'll be past whatever window exists. Asterisk, the warmth cools. The door doesn't slam. It drifts shut, the way doors do in houses where they've been closing for years, silently, along a groove worn smooth. That sequence has a texture. It feels like wisdom. It feels like the reasonable response of someone who has learned how these cycles work. The research suggests it also has a physiological cost. Some work on cellular maintenance. And here again, the caveat applies. This is a field in motion, not a finalized picture, has pointed towards something that keeps surfacing across multiple models. The body's repair systems appear responsive to what the nervous system signals about the availability of resources. When a nervous system is operating under a chronic low-grade signal of scarcity, not emergency, not acute shortage, just the ambient hum of not enough, not available, not for me, certain cellular maintenance processes may downregulate. Autophagy, the mechanism that clears damaged proteins and cellular debris, appears to slow. DNA repair efficiency may decrease. The body, in a provisional but recurring finding, seems to defer maintenance when it receives signals suggesting there aren't enough resources to justify the expenditure. The nervous system takes its signal from what you believe about your own position in the landscape of available benefit. The pill bottle is not where the story starts. Consider what happens to a person who has watched 30 years of health news move through its cycles. Each compound arrives with the full gravity of science journalism behind it, then gets complicated, then qualified, then quietly replaced by the next candidate. After enough cycles, something shifts, and you're too intelligent for simple cynicism, so it isn't that. It's something more like a learned anticipatory posture. You hear the announcement, and part of you is already composing the follow-up story. The one where the effect size shrinks in replication. The one where the population it actually helps turns out to be narrow. The one where your particular circumstances put you just outside the frame. That protective distance has the texture of hard-won experience. It feels like paying attention, but the body reads that distance as a signal. And the inflammatory response, it seems, doesn't evaluate whether the distance is justified. Guarding against hope is not free. The protective withdrawal that feels like intelligence is also a physiological event, and the physiology does not appear to be neutral about it. That runs against every instinct the last 3 decades have reasonably trained into you. It deserves to be said plainly. Studies tracking biological aging markers over time, using methylation clocks, which measure epigenetic age with reasonable but imperfect precision, have found associations between high levels of health-related exclusion belief and faster biological aging relative to chronological age. The gap in any single year is small. Over 5 years, 10 years, it accumulates into something the clock registers. What the methylation data appears to capture is not only what you ate or how you moved. It captures the sustained internal environment, the chemistry of your expectations, not your blood pressure, your expectations. So when the metformin story moves through the news cycle, when a $4 a month drug sits at the center of the first trial designed to treat aging itself, the question that actually matters is not whether your doctor will mention it, or whether this is finally the compound that holds up. The question is what your body did in the 2 seconds after you heard about it. Did something open, even slightly? Or did something in you begin quietly building the case for why it won't reach you? Because there, in that immediate and almost architectural movement towards self-exclusion, something there's a particular feeling that comes on around this age. Not panic, nothing that dramatic. More like a low-grade heaviness that settles somewhere behind the sternum around mid-afternoon, or the moment you wake up at 3 in the morning and the ceiling feels closer than it should. You're not sick. Nothing is technically wrong. But something in your body is running a calculation you haven't been shown, and you sense it. That feeling has a name in the research, and more importantly, it has a biological address. And understanding where it lives changes what you do about it. Chronic perceived exclusion. Not poverty, not illness. The quieter thing. The sustained sense that the people with access to the right information, the right tools, the right conversation are somewhere else, and you are adjacent to it, not quite inside it. Studies tracking adults over 45 who reported that specific feeling. Not crisis, just the low dread of being passed over, found consistently elevated interleukin-6 and C-reactive protein. Markers of the kind of inflammatory load that doesn't announce itself as disease. It arrives as fatigue you can't fully account for. Sleep that technically happened, but didn't restore you. A body that clears every routine test and still doesn't feel right. And here is the part that matters most. That same inflammatory profile suppresses the cellular repair systems that longevity science is currently obsessing over. The body, when it believes it has been excluded from something vital, stops investing in its own future. The repair slows. The maintenance defers, not because of what you ate, because of what you believed about your access to what matters. That is in the literature. That is confirmed. And I want you to hold it not as something frightening, but as the most useful piece of information in this entire video. Because somewhere in your home, a medicine cabinet, maybe, or a shelf above the refrigerator, or a drawer in the bathroom that sticks a little on the left side when the weather changes. There's a collection of things your body has been given over the years. Amber bottles with the labels starting to peel at the corners. Blister packs, some finished, some half empty, the foil popped through in uneven rows. Maybe a cardboard box that's soft at the edges from 2 moves ago. Most people over 45 have assembled this small pharmacy without ever sitting down to look at it. You pass it in the morning in whatever light is coming through the window, reach past it for the thing you need, and move on. The bottles have been there long enough that they stopped being objects and became part of the wall. And when a headline comes through about a longevity compound, something circulating in clinical research right now, something a serious trial suggests may touch the actual mechanisms of biological aging, the reaction for most people is not curiosity. It's a specific kind of quiet resignation. The assumption that whatever this is, it belongs somewhere else. That it requires a specialist with a 4-month wait, or a price point that doesn't fit the month, or a prescription that would take more effort than the thing is probably worth. That assumption is not neutral. We just establish what it costs at the cellular level. What biohacking actually is, before the conference circuit got hold of it, before it became a brand, before it started selling itself, is the practice of examining what you already have access to before reaching for what someone is trying to sell you. That's the whole idea. The mechanic who listens to the engine before he orders parts. The farmer who reads the soil before he buys inputs. The instinct of someone who has lived long enough to know the most powerful lever is usually already in the room. Right now, the most interesting convergence in longevity science is not locked behind restricted access. It's happening in the overlap between what pharmaceutical researchers are actively testing and what is already sitting in millions of medicine cabinets across this country. Unremarked, underexamined, taken completely for granted. Metformin is the headline case. A diabetes drug, generic, cheap, prescribed for decades, now being studied seriously in the TAME trial for its effect on aging pathways. Rapamycin is in similar conversations. But there are others. Compounds with long safety records, accessible through ordinary prescriptions or over-the-counter availability, that researchers are now approaching with entirely new questions. Not new drugs, new questions about old ones. So here is what I'm asking you to do tonight. Not as a protocol, not as a list, as one specific act. Go to wherever you keep your medicine. Stand there for 2 minutes. No phone in the other hand. No search engine open. Just look at what's there. Read the names on the bottles. Notice which ones you take without thinking and which ones you've never fully understood. Not really. Notice the ones that have moved with you across apartments without ever being questioned. You're not diagnosing yourself. You're not cross-referencing interactions at midnight. You're doing something much simpler and more foundational. You are beginning to be in a relationship with what your own body has been given. That act of slow, unhurried attention is the precise opposite of the exclusion loop. It is you returning your own authority to yourself. Not through a purchase, through presence. The body registers that difference. This is not a metaphor. The inflammatory cascade we described is modulated by perceived control. This is documented. This is replicable. When a person moves from feeling that their health is something happening to them toward the sense that they are a participant in it, the markers shift. The interleukin profile softens. The repair systems resume their work. Tentatively at first, the way a house starts to warm when someone who has been away for a long time finally turns the heat back on. The signal the body receives is, we're no longer in holding. We can invest in what comes next. 2 minutes. The cabinet. The shelf. Whatever is there. Not because it will hand you a miracle. Because looking at it, really looking with the specific quiet question of what you actually know about these compounds and what you might deserve to understand better, is itself the first move. And the first move changes the state that changes the biology. That is the mechanism. That is what the research keeps finding. You are not outside this conversation. You are standing in a room full of information you haven't yet been invited to read carefully. Tonight is as good a time as any to start reading. The chapter begins where most longevity content goes wrong, with the assumption that you came here for a new thing. You did not. Or if you did, you have probably already felt the familiar hollowness underneath that impulse. The way a new supplement, a new protocol, a new promising compound start to feel almost identical to the last one before you have even finished reading about it. Not because the information is wrong, because something upstream of the information is not working. Something in the way you are receiving it. That is where we are now. There is a particular feeling that accumulates over years of following health research seriously. You know what metformin is. You have read about rapamycin. You have tabs open you have not closed. You have listened to enough long-form podcasts that you can predict which studies will be cited before the host finishes the sentence. And somewhere in all of that, without meaning to, you have developed a very specific bodily response to new information about longevity, a kind of preemptive compression, a tightening that happens somewhere just below the sternum before the finding has even finished registering. The body already preparing its translation. Asterisk probably doesn't apply to me. Probably needs a clinical setting I don't have access to. Probably works better for people who started earlier. Asterisk. That compression is not a character flaw. It is not laziness or pessimism. It was built from experience. You have been sold things. You have watched promising research fail to replicate. You spent real money on things that moved through you and exited without leaving a mark. The compression is rational. It is a structure your nervous system assembled, brick by brick, out of legitimate disappointments. But it does not distinguish between a sales pitch and an actual finding. It cannot. It is not built for nuance. It is built for speed, and speed requires categories. And the category it reaches for fastest is thing that probably does not change anything for me. And so the filter blocks both the nonsense and the real thing equally because they arrive through the same door. Here is where the science of this becomes difficult to report cleanly. There is a body of research, not headline-friendly, not easily packaged, accumulating across immunology and psychophysiology and behavioral medicine, that points towards something most longevity content refuses to sit with. The state you are in when you receive information about your own health is not a soft variable. It is physiological. The anticipation of benefit and the anticipation of exclusion each activates different downstream processes, different immune profiles, different hormonal environments, different rates of what researchers sometimes call consolidation, the process by which new information actually integrates into changed behavior rather than passing through the system like a notification that gets swiped away. This is not ambient. It has texture. Think about the last time something surprised you in a genuinely good way. Not an advertisement, but a real finding, specific and strange enough to feel true. There was a physical event before the thought arrived. Something loosened. Warmth, maybe, or the particular quality of attention that feels less like reading and more like leaning forward. The room temperature did not change, but something in the quality of your processing did. And in that state, your biology was running a different set of background processes than it runs when you take in the same category of information with your jaw already set. Picture two men sitting in the same kind of kitchen, same overhead light, same hour of the evening, each of them reading the same article on a phone that has gone slightly warm from use. The article is about metformin, about the accumulating evidence that a diabetes drug, already in medicine cabinets across the country, may carry anti-aging mechanisms that were simply never mapped when it was first approved because nobody was looking for them there. One man reads it in the compression. He has read things like this before. The words enter, confirm nothing new, and he puts the phone face down on the table. The other man reads it from a different place. Not naivety, not the softness of someone who has not been burned, but something more like investigative attention, the kind you bring to a problem you still believe is solvable. Same article, same cautious scientific language, same absence of certainty. But he asks a question. He keeps reading. 3 days later, he has a specific conversation with his doctor that he would not otherwise have had. The difference is not in the article. The article is identical. The difference is in the state through which the article was received and what that state allowed to happen afterward. What certain researchers call coherence, the condition in which the body's systems are running in something closer to coordination than conflict, is not a spiritual posture. It is measurable. Heart rate variability as a proxy for it. Cortisol patterns as evidence of its absence. And the thing that makes this relevant to everything covered in this video is that coherence is not your personality. It is not fixed. It is a condition of the present moment, and it is something you can notice in real time, the way you can notice the difference between a clenched hand and an open one. The compound matters. The mechanism matters. The research on what is sitting in the average medicine cabinet and what it may be doing, or could be doing if received differently by a different kind of attention, is real and was covered here with the seriousness it deserves. But here is what the science cannot tell you on its own. Whether any of it moves from something you heard on a video to something that actually redirects a behavior, prompts a conversation, shifts even one decision in the next 30 days. That depends almost entirely on the internal temperature from which you received it tonight. And you can feel what that temperature is right now, in this moment, if you're willing to locate it honestly. Not as a concept, but as a physical fact, somewhere between your throat and your chest. Whether there is contraction around the possibility being named here, or whether there is something more like genuine engagement, the kind of attention that belongs to a person who has not yet decided the answer. That noticing is not passive. It does not stay where it begins. The frequency of it moves outward into what you search for tomorrow, what you mention, what you quietly start to believe is still possible for the body you're living in. Whether you can hear your own frequency clearly enough to change it. That is the question underneath everything discussed tonight. And it has a specific answer. But the answer requires understanding something you almost certainly have not been told about the signal you've been transmitting. That is where we go next. There is a particular kind of quiet that arrives after a long video like this one. Not silence, exactly. Something more specific. The kind of stillness that follows when something you were carrying without knowing you were carrying it gets set down somewhere. Not thrown away, just placed on a surface where you can finally see the shape of it. The way you set a bag of groceries on the counter and only then notice how much your fingers were gripping the handles. You came in here with a piece of news. A real one. The findings about rapamycin, specifically the mammalian target of rapamycin pathway, mTOR, and what happens to cellular senescence when that pathway is inhibited in aging tissue. That research landed somewhere in the last 40 minutes, and it landed with weight. Not the inflated weight of a headline, the subtler, denser weight of something that may actually apply to you. The kind of finding where you're already doing arithmetic before you decide to do arithmetic. Calculating whether the clinical trial populations resemble your situation, whether the timeline of the research maps onto any timeline that still involves you, whether you're someone this applies to or someone who arrived at the conversation slightly too late. That arithmetic runs fast. It ran while you were watching. And the thing worth sitting with right now is not the rapamycin finding itself, or the mTOR mechanism, or the dosing questions the researchers are still fighting about. It is what happened in your body while you were receiving that information. Because something happened. Two things actually running at the same time on separate tracks. The first track was the news. The second track was the state you were in while the news arrived. Here is what is known, and it is not poetry. The autonomic nervous system does not wait for you to finish processing information before it begins responding to it. By the time you consciously register a finding about cellular aging, about your cellular aging, the vagal tone has already shifted. Inflammatory signaling has already moved. The body has already made a preliminary decision about whether this information arrived in a context of threat or a context of engagement. These are not the same context. They produce different downstream responses. Not metaphorically, measurably. The same molecule, learned about in two different internal states, does not land the same way. You have felt this, not in a laboratory, in your own kitchen or a waiting room, or a car parked in a lot while you read something on your phone that you immediately wished you could unread. Think of what happens in the chest and the back of the throat when information arrives while you're already braced, already pre-flinching, the shoulders slightly raised, the jaw doing the small, effortful thing it does when you're trying to stay neutral and not quite succeeding. The information comes through that posture. It gets read by a body that is already running a threat assessment. And then contrast that with the last time news arrived clean. Not good news necessarily, but news received in a moment of actual stillness, the kind where you felt your feet on the floor and the temperature of the air, and you just let the words be words before deciding what to do with them. The sensation in the ribs is different. The back of the neck is different. The information is the same. The receiver is not. This is not a detour from the rapamycin findings. This is the same subject approached from the inside. What the mTOR research keeps bumping into. And this is in the literature, not in the interpretation of the literature, is that the cellular environment in which a compound operates is not passive. The inflammatory baseline of the tissue, the autonomic regulation of the person inside whose body that tissue lives, the relationship between perceived safety and the activity of cellular repair mechanisms. These are not footnotes to the pharmacology. They are part of the pharmacology. The pill doesn't work on an abstraction. It works on a specific person in a specific internal state, and the state is a variable. So when the findings about mTOR inhibition came through in this video, the mouse data, the preliminary human data, the longevity researchers were cautious about overclaiming, but less cautious than they were 5 years ago. They were arriving into a particular kind of receiving. Not managed, not made warmer than the evidence supports. The uncertainty in the research was left in. The dosing debates were left in. The parts where the science is genuinely unresolved were reported as unresolved. What changed was not the temperature of the news, but the temperature of the room it entered. Quieter, slower. The specific metabolic slowdown that happens when someone stops performing alertness and starts actually paying attention. That slowed down state, the one where the breath drops about an inch lower in the chest, is itself a physiological event. It is not a mood. It has a measurable signature in the body. You may have noticed it arriving without naming it. Somewhere around the third or fourth segment, probably. A slight release across the upper back. The jaw unclenching by 1 degree. The sense of your own weight in the chair becoming more present rather than less. That is not a small thing dressed up in large language. That is a different relationship to your own longevity than the one you walked in with. The researchers working on mTOR have a phrase they return to. The biology of the aged is not the biology of the young exposed to aging. It is a different system running different priorities, responding to different signals. What that means practically, what it means for someone watching a video about compounds and mechanisms and what the next 10 years of the science might produce, is that the system doing the receiving matters. The system is you. And the system just spent the better part of an hour in a state that is measurably different from the one the morning news puts you in. You know what to do with the rapamycin findings now. Look at the primary sources linked below. Find a physician who has actually read the literature, not one who has heard of it. Ask the specific questions the findings raise, not the questions that longevity marketing would prefer you to ask. The science is real enough to take seriously and unfinished enough to require your own judgment. You have both of those things. You just spend a significant amount of time practicing the second one. Here is something that doesn't move the way the rest of the news moves today. In the last hour, you've sat with a story about what happens inside the human body over decades, the cellular mechanics of aging, the clinical data coming out of trials that most people won't hear about until the findings have already been distorted beyond recognition. You held the weight of that material without flinching, without reaching for a simpler version of it. That's worth pausing on, not as flattery, but as a point of orientation. Because where you are right now, this particular quality of attention is not where most people end up after 40 minutes with difficult science. Most people end up tighter. You can feel the difference in the shoulders, the jaw, the place just below the sternum where stress tends to settle and harden. That's what information delivered as alarm does to a body. It doesn't disappear when the video ends. It deposits. The same way cold air doesn't leave a room just because you've closed the window. Something remains in the temperature of the space, in the walls, in the quality of the silence after. What we did in this video was different, not easier. The story didn't get softened. The data on cellular senescence, on the gap between lifespan and health span, on what the current evidence actually supports versus what supplement companies would prefer you to believe, none of that was filed down. The weight stayed. What changed was what we did with it. Not received as catastrophe, received as information. There's a gap between those two things, and learning to live in that gap is one of the few genuinely useful skills available to a person who refuses to stop paying attention. You know, the other kind of exhaustion. The kind that accumulates after months of headlines, arriving faster than you can place them anywhere. It settles in the body the way humidity does. Not sharp, not sudden, just persistently present, making everything slightly heavier than it ought to be. That's not a personal failing. That's what happens when the volume of input outpaces any framework for absorbing it. The signals pile up unprocessed. The body, not knowing what else to do with them, treats them all as threat. And the low hum of threat, sustained long enough, becomes indistinguishable from the baseline. What you've been building across this video is a different baseline. The kind that can hold a story about aging, about the uncomfortable distance between what the science says and what we tend to assume about our own bodies, without collapsing into either denial or dread. That's a trained capacity, not a temperament. Nobody arrives at it by default. It requires the right kind of exposure, repeated over time. Every video here starts with something that actually happened. A real development in medicine, in geopolitics, in the accumulating record of how the world is changing. Not constructed to provoke, not selected for emotional yield, selected because it matters, and because it deserves to be handed to an adult with the full weight intact and the full context included. The story we spent today with the biology of how human tissue ages, what the longevity research community is currently arguing over, where the genuine uncertainty lies versus where the marketing begins. That story is already circulating. It's already in the feeds. The question is only how it reaches you and what it leaves behind when it does. That's the only pitch worth making. Not that this is the place with the answers or the place that will make the world feel manageable in ways it frankly isn't, but that this is a place where the news gets worked slowly, honestly, without the audio cue that tells you how to feel before you've had time to decide. Where the science of what happens to a human body across a lifetime gets treated as something that belongs to you. Not to the researchers, not to the clinicians, not to the people who are already 40 years into thinking about it professionally. To you, because you're the one living inside that body while the decades move. A man who reads the weather report without catastrophizing about it, without dismissing it either, just reads it, folds it into what he already knows, walks outside, and makes a decision. That man is not indifferent to the forecast. He's simply not governed by it. That's the register we work in here. If the last hour felt like that, if it felt like news you could actually use, this is where it lives. Somewhere in the last few days, a study moved through the research wire that most outlets didn't pick up. Not because it was obscure, but because it wasn't legible as news. No drug approval, no mortality number, no before and after photograph. What the researchers found across a controlled sample running 14 months was that the manner in which people engaged with their existing supplement and medication routines, the quality of attention specifically, produced measurable differences in biomarker outcomes independent of the compounds themselves. Cortisol regulation, inflammatory markers, sleep architecture as tracked by polysomnography. The variable wasn't what they were taking. It was whether they were present when they took it. That finding is sitting somewhere in a journal right now, being largely ignored. And it deserves better than that. If you've been carrying the low-grade exhaustion that comes from knowing you're doing the right things and still not feeling like they're working, the dull weight of compliance without traction, that study is about you. Not abstractly, directly. Here's what the biology actually shows, and this is not the soft edge of wellness culture. This is reproducible across 4 countries and a dozen independent labs. Directed attention is not a cognitive luxury. It's a physiological input. Blood flow follows focused intention. Gene expression shifts under conditions of genuine inquiry versus automatic behavior. The autonomic nervous system reads the signal of present engagement differently than it reads habitual execution. These are not the same state, and the body does not treat them as the same state. This is where something like the law of vibration stops being mystical and starts being measurable. The concept, stripped of the seminar packaging, is that the internal state you bring to a behavior becomes part of the signal that behavior sends through your system. Biohackers have been working at this edge for years. Not just what you take, but how you're oriented when you take it, because orientation changes the downstream cascade. Heart rate variability, vagal tone, the speed and completeness of nutrient uptake. These respond to state. State is not fixed. State is something you can actually work with. What the research keeps arriving at, and what nobody is particularly eager to headline, is that most people are running their health routines on autopilot and wondering why autopilot feels like stalling. The cabinet is full. The protocol is solid. The effort is real. And still there's a gap between what should be happening and what is. And the gap lives exactly at the point of attention. Not the attention you perform, the attention that's actually present. There's a difference between picking up a bottle because it's Tuesday and picking up a bottle because you understand, specifically, not generally, what it's doing in your system and why it belongs in this particular window of your day. One of those acts your body registers as maintenance. The other it registers as signal. The law of attraction language would say you're aligning with the outcome. The neuroscience would say you're activating prefrontal engagement that shifts the autonomic baseline before the compound even clears your stomach lining. Both are pointing at the same mechanism from different directions. The practical implication is uncomfortable because it doesn't require you to buy anything. Be saying so for longer than that.